Oh my gosh. That was such a list to wake up to.
Good morning.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm still sitting here like so stunned. I remember like anticipating the band so much, and then I like forgot it like the night that it happened, and like went to bed like blissfully unaware, woke up, 7 cards gone.
This was so impactful that my friend who hasn't played Magic in 10 years texted me a screenshot of it and is like, emergency podcast episode?
Well, and that's the thing that was like, I remember being at Command Fest in Sydney and discussing this with people. And when people asked me, I think initially I had said like, yeah, I think like, Cori-Steel cutter, obviously. But I think I got into this kind of like, this like Zen state of being like, actually, they're not going to ban anything. Rotation's happening in 4 weeks. I actually think we're going to wake up and it's going to say standard, no changes. And that's another, like, that would have been another cause for concern of like running around with the room on fire and everything. But I got lulled just into this Zen state of like, you know what? They're actually not going to do anything. And then I woke up and I got screenshots from 3 different people.
Yep. And
I was like, jaw on the floor, bolted upright, immediately sent messages off to other people, just being like, what? Huh?
Yeah, very horror movie trope of like sitting straight upright from a nightmare and going, ah!
Yeah. Well, look, I'm a 1-mana enchantment that you can't play in standard anymore. Kira.
And I'm the new 3-mana Omniscience. Maya.
And today, if you couldn't tell, we're talking about the most recent standard ban
Perhaps
list.
the most significant set of banning since the Affinity days.
I was going to say since like Kaladesh, right? Like this is like one of the biggest like sets of bans that we've had.
I think aside from like at the progenitus of formats, this is one of the like biggest like number of cards banned of all time. And this is like not including cycles, like when they banned a cycle of fetch lands and stuff.
Sure.
But of individual cards, it's insane. 7 cards gone like that.
I think I remember seeing someone say this is the 4th largest ban in Standards history.
Sure, yeah, I believe it.
I was describing this to a lot of different people as a sledgehammer. This was a sledgehammer ban. This was knocking down the format as it stood.
I feel like Sledgehammer is maybe a bit gentle. I think it was more like the...
A lobotomy.
I'm thinking like full like trucky like singlet that's egg stained in the huge like steamroller that just comes rolling over standard.
I thought you were going to say jackhammer when you were going with that.
No.
Steamroller. Look, this
orders
is
of magnitude larger, my dear.
This is a huge shakeup to the format. And you and I haven't seen anything like this in the format for a long time. The last set of bans that I was around for in Standard, as we've mentioned a few times on the podcast, was the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty era when Reckoner, Bankbuster, Invoke Despair, and Fable of the Mirror Breaker all got banned. And that felt big. But it was only... that was only 3 cards, and it was only one deck that really got eviscerated, and that was the Grixis mid-range deck of old. This hit every single deck represented in like the top 8 metagame. Not saying like tournament representation of top 8 because we have an iconic top 8 that was really a top 2. But this hit nigh on everything.
It hit every tier 1 deck and pretty much every tier 2 deck aside from maybe 2.
Woo! Big one.
Yeah.
Really big one. So let's talk about it.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about why.
Yes.
Because that's kind of, when I went into this, that was the question that was floating in my mind. I was like, okay, we banned Cori-Steel cutter, and then did we just ban everything else because we were bored? Did we throw darts at a dartboard and it just so happened that fucking Shadow Clone Jutsu the darts and it hit everything? Like,
well, look, I was going to say, like, the 2 that we are not surprised to see on this list in any way, shape, or form are Cori-Steel cutter and Monstrous Rage. No surprise there whatsoever.
You say that. I'm surprised Monstrous Rage is on the list.
I'm not.
Well, sorry. Now that I know why it's on the list, sure. But when I first saw it, I was surprised Monstrous Rage was on the list. It's a it's a pump spell, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
So let's talk about what we need to talk about here is we need to talk about the ethos of bans, what bans do, what their purpose is, and why we ban cards to begin with. Because that's something, if you're newer into playing 60-card competitive formats, it can seem a bit, especially if this is your first set of bannings you've ever been around for, it can feel very destructive and it can feel bad in a way as well. I had, Maya, do you know what decks that I had built in paper?
Would they be mono red, Izzet, domain, and pixie?
Yeah, pretty much. I also had Omniscience built as well. So I lost everything.
Yeah.
I lost everything. And it just feels
Stonks go down meme, right?
What's the, in the standard divorce, Wizards took all of my playable cards.
Woo, topical.
But let's talk about the ethos of this. Let's talk about why. And one of the first really important points that was touched on in the ban list article that Wizards put out was preparing for a post-rotation standard format. This is kind of your pre-rotation bans, looking at cards that are specifically not rotating this year.
Yeah, a rotation by any other name would smell just as sweet, right?
Yeah. If it looks like a rotation and it quacks like a rotation.
Is it a rotation? If rotation falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it. Fortunately, when Wizards of the Coast release bans, they don't just release a list of cards. They also release an explanation. And if you haven't...
Could you imagine a world in which Wizards is like, these are banned, up to you to figure out why?
I mean, look, that's a very different universe. And there are games that do that, but we'll not go into it.
You come back one day and they're like, Cyber Cryptomancer is banned, and you're like, what?
Okay, yeah, go off. If you haven't read the article yet, it'll make a pretty good companion article to this episode. A lot of what we talk about here is, sort of extrapolating off what we have read through that BNR announcement. And yeah, a lot of what Kira is saying is bang on the money. This is about essentially preparing Standard for the rotation that's happening in August. That's happening with the release of Edge of Eternities. They wanted to push the format towards something new. They wanted to remove the stale play patterns, like unfun interactions, things that limit deck variety, and they wanted to take out the things that were too powerful for Standard. Cori-Steel.
Wow, who could have seen that coming? Who could have seen that coming?
Who's to say? And it is worth noting as well that they mentioned Cori-Steel Cutter specifically in the article and saying, look, we would have banned this regardless if it was pre-rotation or not. It's too much. The people at Wizards did not think this town ain't big enough was too powerful a card for Standard. It's because they wanted to push it in part towards something new. So what we've kind of done is we've kind of taken the bans and we've shoved them into interesting categories, to keep things fresh. And we're going to kind of break them down and talk about why these cards were banned and what that means going forward. So Kira, talk to me about the cards that were hard to interact with on this list.
Talking about the issues of interaction here, we're talking about Cori-Steel Cutter and Up the Beanstalk. And these were cards that were really difficult to interact with in a one-for-one way. And what that means is you play your Cori-Steel Cutter and I suplex it to get rid of it. That is a one-for-one exchange. You've played one card, I've played one card. And the issue with both of these cards in the realm of Cori-Steel Cutter is Cori-Steel Cutter is actually 10 Monastery Swift Spears wrapped up in a package, in a trench coat. And, you cast your two spells, you get what is essentially a Monastery Swift Spear. You get a 1/1 monk creature token with prowess. And it becomes difficult to interact on that axis because now you have to expend 2 cards to deal with their 1 card that just happens to provide what is essentially another card. And the same thing happens with Up the Beanstalk. Up the Beanstalk already does not exist as a 1-for-1 because it replaces itself the moment it's played. And so you're already down on card advantage because they're net neutral on cards and you are -1. And that's really difficult in this format. And the ways that you would interact with these cards are typically counterspells. But the counterspells in the format aren't fantastic right now. And so the interactions of these two in the format were just far and above the best. These were fantastic cards with fantastic payoffs. Cori-Steel Cutter essentially provided you with Monastery Swift Spears. And Maya, you've commented before on how it basically is card advantage because it's giving you, again, a Monastery Swiftspear. And Up the Beanstalk was literal card advantage. It was drawing you cards for playing expensive cards.
For playing cards with cost reduction.
For playing cards with card reduction. Like, the point was that you would expend resources in a different way, and it would reward you with your cards. So you were always, positive on your exchanges, as your opponent generally wasn't, unless you're playing the mirror.
So many cards are way better if you add draw a card to them.
Yes, and most cards are actually better if you add draw a card to them. The other thing that everyone really experienced as well was that the meta had to warp around these cards. Back when Domain Overlords was the dominant archetype, everything had to warp around figuring out how to get rid of Up the Beanstalk. And there's not a ton of efficient ways to do that don't also benefit your opponent in some way. Like, get lost. Everybody loves map tokens. I love a map token. You love a map token. And so you were forced to run things like temporary lockdown, and you were forced to hinder your own plan to counter what the best decks in the format were doing. And we saw that happen with Cori-Steel Cutter pretty much immediately. Cori-Steel Cutter immediately warped the format. Everything was playing, every Izzet deck bent the knee to play that card. Even mono red decks were starting to play the card, and it pushed Izzet into unreasonable play rates. This deck was everywhere, and it forced out a lot of other decks in the format. Decks that you were seeing reasonable play rates of, like Orzhov Pixie, disappeared because they couldn't compete with the value that was being provided by Cori-Steel Cutter. And so that issue of interaction was really key to needing to remove it. And the power level as well. Like, this card is being played in every format because it's just that good. And it's, as you've touched on, it's too powerful for standard. It just can't exist in this environment without warping the format around it like a super massive black hole.
And part of that warping is that it forced a lot of decks, it forced decks to the top of the metagame that were playing really particular pieces of interaction. There are not many good ways to interact with a Cori-Steel Cutter. The best way is, of course, a counterspell. The counterspells are, as we've said, really poorly positioned in this metagame, or were. So the only really reactive answer that you can have to a Cori-Steel Cutter is the temporary lockdown. And that's part of why we started to see Orzhov Pixie kind of before the VV and the Drakehatcher adaptations of Izzet. We started to see temporary lockdown becoming a staple in both Abuelo's Awakening decks and the Orzhov decks, and all the other decks that didn't have access to that as not only a piece of action, but a piece of interaction that provided some sort of benefit, we saw that necessarily fall off. There hasn't been a compelling control deck in Standard for a while. I say that knowing that Jeskai Control is a thing. Jeskai Control did have a good matchup against Izzet prior to the printing of VV or Nydia and prior to the kind of slower version of the deck, but it folded to everything else and as such got pushed out of the metagame. It's really, really hard for a healthy metagame to exist around Cori-Steel Cutter at the moment because it is just too good. And lo and behold, it is gone. The king is dead, long live the king.
I'm wearing a shirt that says down with Cori-Steel Cutter.
It's crazy. It's actually really pretty. You got that printed pretty quick.
Thank you. That is just one set of cards. We had 7 cards banned.
Oh, yeah, baby.
And the next category that we're kind of going to talk about is the issues of efficiency and explosiveness. Maya, what happened?
So the cards we're talking about here are Heartfire Hero and Monstrous Rage. And the TLDR is they are extremely efficient, aggressive cards in that they are 1 mana, they are the best creature types they can be. So specifically, Heartfire Hero is a mouse, and Monstrous Rage is an instant. And Monstrous Rage is also probably the most efficient combat trick we have ever seen. The fact that it leaves behind a 1/1 and generates trample is a real problem, because it warps the kind of aggro decks to play a combo-like game plan. And we saw that in the initial iterations of these decks that were playing Leyline of Residence and the Cacophony Scamps, and were really leaning into this kind of very aggressive turn 2, turn 3 kill using the slick shots, using Heartfire Hero, using Cacophony Scamp, and using ways to pump those creatures relatively quickly. And as a result, it warps the format overall in a way that causes a very high demand but extremely specific removal. If you can't interact on 1 mana or you don't have a temporary lockdown, you are dead.
Yeah.
Right. That was just the truth of playing in this sort of mono red world because of the inherent combo nature. And Trample and Double Strike disincentivized blocking, which removed from the equation a lot of decks that are traditionally good against aggro decks, things like life gain decks and things like token decks. So notably, Mono White Caretaker would have been a good deck against Mono Red if it were not for the fact that Monstrous Rage essentially invalidated blocking with your 1/1 token. Additionally, Heartfire Hero was too explosive, but also too resilient. Heartfire Hero into Manifold Mouse is one of the most crazy nonsense 1/2 plays that you can do.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, attacking for 4 with Double Strike on turn 2 is good, and then attacking for 6 on turn 3, Monstrous Rage notwithstanding, is still kind of, it's just crazy. But the fact that it was really resilient to removal with its death trigger as well made it just that little bit too problematic, right? It enabled the Callous Sellsword combo, but it also meant that when your opponent spent a cut down to remove your 4/4 Heartfire Hero, so your 2/2 Heartfire Hero, your 4 total power toughness Heartfire Hero, it would just kind of come back and hit you for a bunch. And the only effective way to deal with it was with an early Nowhere to Run or Grimbauble. And as soon as it got out of control, it was a real problem until you were getting to the point where you had consistent exile removal. And there wasn't a great deal of that in the format that was seeing play, short of Anoint with Affliction.
Additionally as well, you typically resigned yourself to taking some amount of damage from Heartfire Hero, because even with Anoint with Affliction and other exile effects, occasionally like the best response was, you know, your opponent, turn 1 Mountain, Heartfire Hero, you turn 1 Swamp, cut down, take 1 damage. And it feels like you still got attacked no matter what. But there was moments where you just kind of resigned yourself to, yep, I'm about to take 5 damage from a Heartfire Hero because I need it gone. And I remember watching, there was a match that was on Pro Tour feature, like it was on the feature table, and I watched someone pump up their opponent's creature so that their Heartfire Hero died, and they won the game that way. And I just sat there, like, hands folded, sad. Like, it was brilliant. It was so brilliant to watch because the opponent was dead if the Heartfire Hero died. And so they blocked it because it was a smaller creature blocking a Heartfire Hero, and their opponent goes, watch this. It's just, your creature's bigger than mine. Take 5 damage. You're on 5 life. Good night.
These sort of mono red mirrors, I will say, they do make for very good skill testing Magic. In terms of like actually watching 2 people play a game of Magic where each individual decision point matters, it is very good. But it is not overall healthy for a broader standard format. And as such, goodbye.
Goodbye.
The next issue that they talked about in the BNR announcement, and the next one we're going to talk about now, is the issue of things that are fun, or rather, things that are not fun. Kira, tell me about things that are not fun.
So this is actually a really interesting one for me to start off on as well, because I did not agree with the first card on this list. The first card on this list is Hopeless Nightmare, which is everyone's favorite 1 mana, lose 2 life, discard a card. And the reason this card is so vicious is in those pixie decks. If you can get your opponent to discard 2 cards and lose 4 life by turn 2, that is an amazing like front-running start. But the problem, of course, is that's not fun for your opponent. That feels bad, you know, because you have no way really to interact with that, especially if your opponent is on the play and they turn 1 Swamp, Hopeless Nightmare, and you have no choice but to discard. That is off to a bad start. So the first card that we're talking about in terms of this issue is of fun is Hopeless Nightmare, and the second is This Town Ain't Big Enough. Notably, of like all of the cards, out of the 7 cards that were banned in Standard, 2 of them are rares. The rest are commons and uncommons. And that speaks to the power level that we're dealing with in Standard. It is not your bomb mythic or your bomb rare that is leading the charge here.
Sheoldred's still not on the ban list.
Sheoldred is still not on the... at least she's rotating soon. Yay! She's not on the ban list, though, because she was powerful, but never format warping. And, well, for a while... We're not here to talk about Sheoldred right now, okay? That's the next episode. I don't want to talk about her right now. These cards provided the decks that they existed in with a unique way to attack the game on axes that were really difficult to interact with. Both of these cards gave birth to archetypes that just sucked, I think is the way that a lot of people would explain the experience. You had Dimir Bounce, Esper Bounce, and then Orzhov Pixie. And these were all iterations of the same bounce type effects in different ways.
The big issue with these cards is that they provided decks with like a really unique way to attack a game that shored up existing weaknesses that you would expect from the archetypes, right? And that is a frustrating thing to play against. Nurturing Nightmare allowed, Pixie, especially Orzhov Pixie, which should be a grindy mid-range strategy, to be an aggro deck, right? It shortened this, it closed the scope of the game by forcing your opponent to repeatedly discard cards, which made their potential answers lower and lower, but it also shocked them every time it came into play and provided you with a plethora of small flyers, which is really, really good against a lot of the creature decks in the format, and was part of why things like Golgari Midrange were pushed out. This Town Ain't Big Enough and Storm Chaser's talent gave aggressive synergy decks a level of inevitability, especially in the face of permanent focus decks, that shored up matchups like Control that shouldn't have otherwise been favoured. The way Control decks is supposed to beat these synergy decks is by disrupting important pieces and then going over the top with value. And this is how things like, cast a Shiko, flashback a stock up is really, really good. But when your opponent has infinite bounce and infinite prowess triggers and infinite hopeless nightmares, then all of a sudden, no matter how much value you generate off one or two really high quality pieces, you lose the long game. And that's a really frustrating play pattern, and the kinds of play patterns that would keep this style of deck in check. This Town Ain't Big Enough loops are also frustrating in the options for like large end the game threats that currently exist, right? A lot of the really powerful things that you could do as a mid-range deck was curve out, and then you had the best thing on the board. You had a Sheoldred the Apocalypse.
Stop saying her name.
You had an Archfiend of the Dross, or you had an Elspeth Stormslayer, right? Those cards are incredibly powerful. You invest a lot of mana into them. When they can be routinely answered for 2 mana in a way that is both tempo and value positive for an opponent, it locks out just a few too many archetypes in a way that is not fun to interact with. The rock, paper, scissors nature of like archetype matchups is a really important fundamental part of Magic. It is what keeps Magic fun to play, because there isn't one deck that beats them all, so to speak. And sometimes there is in Magic. Sometimes the cards are so powerful that they can overpower even the best versions of the archetype that's supposed to beat them. We saw this with Cori-Steel. But broadly speaking, if you want to beat a given deck, there is usually a way. There is usually a weakness you can exploit or an archetype you can play, and these cards removed that from the equation in a very real way, and in a way that was frustrating to a lot of players. And lo and behold, they are gone. I, for one, am sad about losing Hopeless Nightmare.
I was going to say, when I saw Hopeless Nightmare on the list, my first thought was, Maya's Pixie deck is so hurting for this.
Hey, but now the best tier 2 deck apparently is Orzhov midrange, so I'm not that mad, but I am still quite mad.
I will say, if I had to pick a blue spell to be banned this time around, my 2 picks were either going to be This Town Ain't Big Enough or Stock Up.
I don't think Stock Up needs to be banned. I think Storm Chaser's talent is the other.
I don't think it needs to be banned either, but because this is a ban that hit every single color, if someone had said, Kira, what's a blue card that should be banned, it was going to be This Town Ain't Big Enough or Stock Up.
Sure.
Just because of the archetypes that it was propping up.
Yeah, I think, yes. Agreed. No further comment.
Well, look, so we have the issue of fun. Let's talk about the issue of consistency. And this is where we talk about the second rare that's on this ban list, and that is Abuelo's Awakening. This was your 4 mana, put Omniscience into play, win the game.
Hey, that's pretty good.
One of the best ways to win the game is on turn 4 is just reanimate an Omniscience, it turns out. This was the best combo deck in Standard.
By far.
By and large, this was the best combo deck in Standard. It was extremely consistent and extremely redundant, and new cards made it better each time. And this is specifically looking at like Meringue River Regent and Roiling Dragonstorm. 4 mana is so cheap. Some would say too cheap for a non-creature reanimate spell. And the downside of it becoming a creature as gets reanimated as a 1/1 spirit is easily solvable when the thing you're reanimating lets you cast spells for free. This deck demanded too much of too many other archetypes and decks in the format, and it pushed fringe decks out.
The big issue with Abuelo's Awakening was less the fact that the play pattern itself was too strong, even though it was very, very strong. And it was sort of this perfect storm of it required decks to be doing one of two things. It required you to kill your opponent by turn 4 on the play, or it required you to have a counterspell or enough redundant creature removal that you could fight through an Omniscience. Those are not easy things to do. So the only decks that had meaningful game against this deck were the red and Izzet decks that were killing you very quickly, and the Shiko Paragon of the Way control decks that just got to play negate. Negate's still pretty good against Abuelo's Awakening, as it turns out. Unfortunately, this pushes a lot of other decks out of the format, right? And I know this is I like to talk about Golgari midrange as the poster child for things this format doesn't allow. But pretty much every deck we have just spoken out preyed really heavily on these sort of mid-range, 1-for-1, lots of removal, lots of disruption, but generally big creature kind of strategies. And Abuelo's Awakening was one of them. With the printing of Moraine River Region and Roiling Dragonstorm in Tarkir Dragonstorm, you no longer need to play the Invasion of Arcavios and other bad cards like Jeskai Revelation or Flotsam Jetsam. You instead have this self-contained loop that is also pushing you towards your game plan, which added this level of redundancy that is just kind of ridiculous. And there were very real Game 1 games with Abuelo's Awakening where you just cast Moraine River Agent and you attacked a couple of times and your opponent died. And the culmination of all those things means that Abuelo's Awakening was just too strong and was likely to continue to be the best combo deck in the format. And they wanted something new. And so, auf Wiedersehen.
And what we're looking at here as well is, if you'll notice, all the cards that are on the ban list are cards that would have been remaining in the standard format for at least the next standard cycle. Cards from Wilds of Eldring, cards from Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and even looking at something like Cori-Steel, which would have been 2 years in the future. This is for the health of the format. The early ban, we're early rotating. We're early rotating some cards out of the format. So, what will the overall effect be?
I have no idea.
I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen.
This ban cycle is such a colossal shakeup of the format, right? Even if you just removed Cori-Steel, I couldn't tell you what the format looks like because Cori-Steel decks were pushing out so many very strong interactive decks. I think the format would fundamentally shift with the absence of that card. But with the other 6 as well, I think with the other 6 cards and then rotation in August, I think the format is very likely to be completely unrecognizable.
It's so funny that you mentioned that because I saw an event 2 days ago from a standard challenge top 8 post ban, and the top decks were Dimir Midrange, Mono White Tokens, Izzet Cauldron, and Orzhov Pixie. That is an unrecognizable top 4. We haven't seen a top 4 that looks like that in the last 3 or 4 months. This is truly a new standard format.
I think this is the best time to brew. We do know for a fact that given what has just happened, the format is very likely to be a full turn or even a turn and a half slower than what it has been, right? We are going from a turn 3, turn 4 format to a turn 4, turn 5 format, almost certainly, with the exception maybe of the mono red decks. That means more room for combo and more room for control, which is it is the brewer's paradise. Get your hands on some new cards, go deep, knee deep again into the standard format and see what you can dredge up from the bottom of tier 3, because I think you'll be surprised. I think we will start seeing new breakout decks. But Kira, if you want to win now, what should you be playing?
You should be playing everything that is untouched. anything that did not get hit by bans, you should be playing. So Dimir Demons, Golgari midrange, Jeskai control, Oculus, Roots.
Dimir Tempo.
Things that did not get hit by the bans are going to be great decks to play because they are already tried and tested. These are going to be your low tier 2, high tier 3 decks, and decks that just could not survive in the current meta up against things like the previous now mono red aggro and Izzet prowess. Go crazy, go nuts. Play fringe decks. This is going to be, the next 4 weeks are going to be your element of surprise.
This is the perfect time to pull out your Colstoke Gearhulk combo. Let's go!
Well, and I'm thinking, there's a mill deck that did pretty well at a random event. Go nuts right now, especially because we're about to see a rotation happening in 4 weeks. Who cares? Go nuts.
Play nonsense. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Just enjoy.
Maya, what are you going to be playing?
So I'm using this kind of intermediary period between now and rotation to just play some degenerate combo nonsense. I'm not trying to grind. I am just using it as an excuse to play Temur Lands and Boros Quintorius combo.
Yep.
Are they good?
Ooh, Discover combo.
I wouldn't describe them as excellent. They are, but what they are is they are now fringe playable in a way that they weren't before in a format that was solved and full of Izzet. I can play them on the ladder and I can expect to do reasonably well up to a certain point. And I'm going to do that because I love nonsense, stupid, dumb, bad combo decks. That is what I live for, and that is all you'll see me playing on the ladder for at least until Edge of Eternities comes out. Kira?
Tifa Punch, mono green. I want my mono green Tifa Punch deck to finally be in a position to do well. I want to be the aggro. Look at me. I am the aggro deck now.
I am the aggro.
I am the aggro deck now. I think green Tifa Punch, I do think there's a world in which mono white tokens makes a really strong comeback, and frankly, not for nothing, I'm looking at being a problem in playing Azorius Control.
Yeah. Azorius Control seems like it just got a huge leg up. Because you don't need to answer anything quickly anymore. And you can just play Sunfall and Ultima and cast an Elspeth, and eventually they die.
It's going to be really fun seeing how the format changes now post-ban and soon post-rotation. It's going to be a really fun couple of weeks coming up.
With all that said, that is all that we have for you today. We look forward to seeing you again next week. New episodes release on Mondays at 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. Until then, you can keep track of all our releases at Raise MTG on both Instagram and Blue Sky. You can find Kira on the same platforms at kirapovera.jpg and myself at MayaMTG. A big thank you to the State Library of Victoria for the ongoing use of their space. And until next week, remember, out there, death and salvation may lie on either side of the same ridge of sand.